folks, welcome to today's Brownbag on behalf of the Center for Russian and East European and Eurasian Studies. We welcome you. We have if you don't know us, we do a Brownbag in here every week. You can find us here on Tuesdays afternoon talking about some aspect of interest to folks interested in Russian, East European and Eurasian studies. And as usual, I want to introduce a few other things that we've got coming later in the week before I introduce our speaker for today. I think you'll be pleased with the lineup in general for REIS events. We have a sign-up sheet over there if you want to receive a weekly bulletin of this week's activities. And we've also got an events listing for you to pick it up, as well as a lot of other goodies, including the latest REIS newsletter. Coming later in the week, we've got on Wednesday, they're going to start off this International Peace and Conflict Film Festival. It'll be Wednesday at 5 p.m. at Spencer Museum of Art. We're going to take part in this. We've got one that's scheduled for October 9th. And we'll actually be having a former ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina who's going to be in. Ambassador Victor Yakovich is going to come in and talk about peacekeeping. But this is the kickoff, and they're going to have a film called Caterpillar. This is the Center for East Asian Studies contribution to that. On Friday, then, there's going to be a Human Migration Fall 2013 lecture series kickoff, and that's going to start with Michael Crawford talking about causes and consequences of human migration, evolutionary perspective. I don't get Professor Crawford in here to talk very much, but he has given brown bags on all kinds of different topics. But he works in our area, has done a lot of work in Siberia and Russian Far East. And then also on Friday, we've got the annual Priest-Fall Mixer and Potluck. That's from 5 to 8 at the Lawrence Train Depot. That's on North 2nd Street, the intersection of 2nd and Locust. So you're welcome to bring your favorite dish. It's BYOB, bring a friend, bring as many people as you want. We'd love to see you there to come and meet fellow students and fellow faculty. Let's see, aside from that, we also have a Russian film series that's going to start up in Kansas City. That's going to take place at Edwards campus. And we didn't schedule this very well in terms of the overlap, but there are different audiences, I think. And this one's going to be a film called Progrunka, which is called The Stroll, and that takes place at 6 p.m. Up at Edwards. Our speaker today is David Besson, who is a professor in physics and astronomy. I looked over the website in preparation for doing this introduction, and I saw just a myriad number of acronyms having to do with high energy experimental physics.
I faked them all.
You do list yourself in interesting, sort of paradigms as far as some of these.
That part is true.
But I invited Dave in to speak specifically. He's spent the summer actually in Moscow working on a collaborative project, although he is listed as the lead scientist on a project with an institute in Moscow doing research on high energy physics and nuclear medicine with the use of silicon photomultipliers. And I like looking at professors' websites. Sometimes you get the most interesting sort of information about them. He was listed under other, if you look, his band was listed as one of the top 25 unsigned bands in Rolling Stone magazine in 1993.
That's true.
And even more impressive, I think, first in his age group for the race around the world in South Pole in 2004.
That's right. No, you basically just run around literally the South Pole and run around the pole. All right, so I'm going to start with just giving you some background and some personal history. This will be a very personal view of the subject. But I'm going to have to give you some background to sort of lead up to the sort of climax of the story, which sort of has occurred in the last month or so. So in 1989, I was a grad student at Cornell, and we had a visitor to our lab from the Institute of Particle Physics in Novosibirsk, Alexei Andreyevich. And I just casually went up to the dude and I said, well, I'm sort of interested in going to Russia sometime. I had no Russian skills, not that I have any now. And he said, sure, just sign here and we'll send you over there. And I just sort of insinuated myself into a nice little lab job at the institute there, where they had a facility that was similar to the ones that we had at Cornell, and that's how I sort of began my association with Russian science. In 1989, or sorry, 1990, okay, 1990, 1983, I was named, through some fluke, the quote-unquote analysis coordinator for this experiment at Cornell. It's a particle physics experiment. It's an atom smash, about 300 people. And it does basic measurements of particle physics phenomena, without going into too much detail. And our world antagonists were across the pond in Germany, the Argus experiment. And the Argus experiment was also a group of about 200 people, and was primarily run by, or the main contributor to that group, whereas Clio was an entirely US operation, because it's about 30 US universities. Argus was a group primarily of Germans and Russians. And the main motive force of the Argus group was this guy, Misha Danilov, who worked at the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics in Moscow. And they were very aggressive. Misha was a smart guy, as opposed to myself, who tended to be much more conservative, and I needed that, you know. Misha was much more aggressive, and they beat us to the punch on a few pretty noteworthy discoveries, largely due to Misha's drive and the fact that he had some very good students. And we'll come back to Misha later. And then in the last 20 years, I sort of built my association with Russian science over the last 2 decades. And I now have a couple of working collaborative experiments with Russian physicists. This is over here is a picture of an experiment that we have in Tunka Valley. I don't know if you know where it is, but it's pretty much in the crease between Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Russia. It's quite a bit southwest, not that far southwest from Irkutsk. And this is a cosmic ray detection experiment, which explains why there are these cows over here. The cows and the idea is that on a dark night, a cosmic ray, if you don't know what a cosmic ray is, just a very high energy particle that comes from, you know, somewhere outside of the Earth's atmosphere. It comes screaming down through the atmosphere, and some of the upper atmosphere, it hits an air molecule, and it produces a stream of debris and radiation. You can actually collect that radiation and debris and measure it on the ground in these detectors. There's a little detector in there, and there's a lot of them scattered out. Here's another one, here's another one. And from that you can reconstruct the attributes of the initial cosmic ray, maybe even point back to some bright spot in the sky, like an exploding star or something that created it. And this is an experiment that we have going on in Tunga Valley. It was on. Okay. Oh, yeah. No. It should be on. Okay. All right, and here's our contribution. We very conveniently, the cows stayed exactly in the same place for this picture, so you get a sense of perspective. And we put together this large radio wave antenna, and the radio wave antenna is looking up into the sky for radio waves produced when this cosmic ray interacts high in the atmosphere and produces this spray of radiation coming down. Here's Mark and Jessica, who designed and built the antenna. This is back about 5 years ago. Here's Mark building or digging the trench for the foot of the antenna. That's why we have undergrads here at KU. This is a little fence that we constructed for, you know, to prevent bovine incursion. And remarks of when they started this project, they were just 2 students working together on this little adventure in Russia. And since then, actually, they've gotten married, which is a cautionary tale. This is another experiment that I'm working on in association with a group based in St. Petersburg, the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute. They have bored a hole. They've actually literally dug a 2-mile hole through the ice sheet. This is actually the borer, the drill that drills this hole. It's cored down to about, it's cored actually now down to this area where there's actually this lake underneath 2 miles of ice. And in fact, they've extracted a sample of water from this lake, and there appears to be viable life in that sample of water, which is presuming that it's not the result of their own contamination, which they've taken pains to avoid. But what's particularly interesting is that this is exactly the same formation, the same geological formation that exists on Europa, a moon of Jupiter, where there's a thick ice sheet and there's water underneath. Also, the Saturnian moon Enceladus, which I'm going to be joining a NASA mission to try and probe this layer of water to see if that also may contain viable life. So anyway, so this is another project that I'm involved in. And more arcanely, I guess in a couple of months, every year, unlike the US, so the US has an interior station at South Pole and supplies that interior station primarily by bringing an icebreaker to the main port here on the coast at McMurdo, and then flying provisions in by C-130 aircraft. The Russians do something different. They actually have a station here, Station Progress, and they have an overland traverse that basically just drags their provisions in on the back of tractors. It turns out that this is about 3 times more cost efficient than sending it in by plane. And in fact, within the next year, we've arranged to actually take some measurements of, measurements of temperature and also surface topology, piggybacking off of the traverse, and hopefully that will happen this year. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. And up until I guess maybe March or so, I had actually planned on spending the summer in Novosibirsk working on a parallel project. In January 2013, I got this email from my friend Pasha. Pasha was a graduate student of Mishas at ITEP from Argus, and I was in fact familiar with Pasha for a while. And he's since sort of become Misha's main protege at ITEP. And let me just skip forward. So this is a BBC release going back to 2010, which basically announces this program that Putin had announced. And the idea of the program is to attract high-profile scientists. They allow for one exception, fortunately for me, from within the country and abroad to work at Russian universities. And they choose, I think there's something like a 4% success rate, and they choose people, and those individuals get something like $1 million a year to build a laboratory at a Russian university of interest. Turns out that the Russian university was not really chosen. It was the Russian university that I'm associated with is the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute in Moscow. But I'll point out that it's conspicuously intended for use with a Russian university as opposed to a Russian institute, which is part of the Academy of Science, which I'll get back to later. So this was the initial announcement, and that's the program to which Pasha had invited me to serve as the quote-unquote leading foreign scientist, which seemed to me like an extremely contrived title, and in fact this title kept coming up over and over again. I later found out that this title of leading foreign scientist was not invented by Pasha or even Putin, but actually goes back to Peter the Great, when he actually put together the Academy of Science. I'll show in a second. And that program, or that leading foreign scientist, again, is supposed to set up a laboratory, and that laboratory will, right now, comprises about 15 people. And the thrust of the science is to do, as Bart said, silicon photomultipliers, which doesn't mean very much to you, but it's essentially just solar cell technology. It's a glorified version of what the leaf of every tree does. It takes sunlight and turns it into energy. And there are various spin-offs that we're using. And Pasha closed his email by saying, "You will have the true experience of being a real Russian professor," which is certainly true to the extent that I spent 3 months there and I never got paid. Okay, so here's... And my reaction was, well, I had set up this this summer in Novosibirsk, which was a pretty nice place, out of the way. I didn't really want to be in Moscow for the summer, but I wanted to be a good guy. I looked at the previous competitions, 4% success rate. There were 3 Nobel Prize winners who had been chosen as foreign leading scientists. And since that time, since the good old days, back when I was a rock and roll star, I had migrated into cosmic ray physics, which was much different than atom smasher physics, which is what this was based on. So I concluded that anyone who actually looked at my record would realize that I had now drifted so far off that I had nothing in common with these guys. So I concluded that I could, serve as the, the little bogeyman on this project, and we'd have no chance of success. My only concern is that my counterpart on the Russian side was my old nemesis, Misha. And Misha was a very smart guy, and I looked through their proposal, and it was a pretty good proposal. And based on this, I concluded that it had maybe some small chance. But my conclusion was that it was safe and that it would play along. And then at the end of April, I found out that we had actually been selected, again, much to my surprise. So this is a low-resolution picture of, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's right on Kashirskaya Chaussee. Just to the left of this picture is Kolomenskaya Park, which is actually a quite nice park. This is the first time I had seen it. And it has a very nice promenade by the river, which I had the pleasure of being able to go running in the morning. The history of Mifi, it's about 50 or 60, it goes back to the 40s actually. And it has some very illustrious names associated with it. It's a relatively large complex, and it's one of the few universities that has a nuclear reactor. So it was originally created as a place, as sort of a mill for churning out, lots of good people who would serve, who would be very useful for Cold War nuclear activities. So in any case, so we got this grant, and here is a picture of a lot of the people, not all the people in this group. This is Danilov, this is his Dasha, and here is Pasha, his main protege, who sort of introduced or had invited me, and here are my kids, Jimmy and Sidra. This is at the end of June. So that's the group. Okay. I won't go into detail with this. This is a little bit of politics, but having done, having essentially now been swept into this current, I will mention that I'm trying to figure out how I can sort of leverage this into additional support, and I've actually applied for support to send students to Russia, in part to work on this lab that we're putting together in the next 3 summers. I have no idea whether I'll be successful, but I've actually applied for support, and if you're interested, or you know somebody who may be interested, this would be for something like 6 weeks in the next 3 summers. There's a stipend of $500 per week, and you get housing. And there's also the possibility, which I wanted to discuss with Maria, of submitting a, the NSF has this Science, Technology, and Society program, which may also be an entree for additional funding. It's intended to look at some of the sociological impacts of science policy, for instance, in the U.S. versus another country, in this case, Russia. All right, so having accepted, or having gone there, what I did on my summer vacation. Well, I signed a lot of obscure documents as a leading foreign scientist, and it was punctuated by supplicating to the MIFI rector. Of course, at Russian universities, there is the rector, aka the godfather, and if you want anything to happen, it has to, has to go through the rector. And the rector had actually given me his cell phone number, but I didn't actually know if it was acceptable. Is this, I mean, I guess I could have Googled, Russian protocol cell phone number rector. So whenever I wanted something done, I was always too timid to actually call him on his cell phone number. So I had to actually write out something. I had to write a little note asking what I wanted, give it to his administrative assistant, and then that would go to Anatoly, and then Anatoly would call me and say, "Oh, you should have called me on my cell phone." All right, and then just a couple of observations. I had not sort of interacted on the university level for a while. The Russian bureaucracy is, unfortunately, well, for better or worse, is still alive and well. And I was a little surprised that there was not an apparent sense of urgency that this is a big obstacle to moving things forwards. I think that was my biggest impression. And as one example, so for instance, Pasha and Misha are primarily employed at the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics. But they must have at least a 25%, and they have joint appointments at the university, at MIFI. So typically, an institute is associated with the university, which is sort of a feeder for students. But they have to have at least a 25% appointment in order to take graduate students. So the university tends to use this sort of selectively in order to promote certain avenues of research or certain professors internally and suppress other avenues back to the institutes. And this interplay between the Academy of Science Institutes and the university was something that I didn't have any real sense of before I got there, and it becomes crucial to what follows in this presentation. So, a quick primer on the structure of Russian scientists. Again, there are universities such as Moscow State, MIFI, St. Petersburg State, etc., Novosibirsk State. And there are institutes which are generally run by the Russian Academy of Science down here. And as I said before, at least in physics, universities are typically feeders of students to research institutes. So for instance, MIFI is a feeder for ITEP. Let's see. The Moscow Physics and Technological University is a feeder for the Institute of Nuclear Research in Moscow, and so on and so forth. Okay, here is what pops up when, and probably, I don't know how many of you are, maybe all of you know that this is the Russian Academy of Science building. It's, I guess it's intended to demonstrate that you don't need a deep appreciation of architecture to be a good scientist. I don't know if this is just unfinished or if it's...
No, it's finished, but it's intended to look unfinished.
Okay, what succeeds? And this is what pops up on their website, and as you see here, Peter I, in fact, invited into the academy leading foreign scientists. That's where that title comes from. And in fact, some of the original foreign scientists that were invited were names as illustrious as Daniel Bernoulli, who is, of course, the person who was responsible for the Bernoulli equation, which is what the Wright brothers realized they had to understand in order to master flight. They got some very big names to head this, or to be involved in this. Okay, now when I got to MIFI, I sort of became aware that there was something of a competition that was developing between the university side and the Academy of Science. And I spoke to a couple of faculty at MIFI, university side, and they reinforced this idea that the Academy of Science was bloated. And this is something of a tenure dystopia. This is the worst you can imagine of tenure. These are all the people who get tenure and then, and then sit and, stare out the window. And they sort of, you can plot their lack of productivity as a function of time after getting tenure. And maybe this is what's happened. If you look at some of the statistics, for instance, the Russian Academy of Science has something like 57,000 members. It's the Chinese Academy of Science. There's Max Planck Institute in Germany, which is at least an institute of science. And you look at the number of publications per researcher, and it's abysmal for the Academy of Science. And this, again, lends credibility to the notion that the Academy of Science has sort of atrophied over time. The relative budgets, however, are a factor of 3 to 1 in favor of the Academy of Science. So I put this number up here. The Russian Academy of Science has a budget about $2.1 billion per year. The NSF has a budget which is about almost a factor of 4 times higher. And of course, for people who are doing physics, such as myself, there are other ways of getting support also, for instance, through the Department of Energy. But it's clear that at least Putin is trying to increasingly funnel money into the university side and away from the Academy of Science. And what's more, corruption is in fact rampant. This is, well, maybe true on both sides. I found this little note, which I wasn't aware of, but the Brookings Institution evidently found that at least 16 pages of Putin's doctoral dissertation was signed in Russian. I wasn't aware of that. I don't know if it's true, but at least, yeah, I found that online. So, a couple of more observations. The fact that the Academy of Science is separated from the universities, even though the universities are feeders to the Academy of Science, the fact they're physically separated introduces another layer of separation between them and makes it more difficult for them to just, to move forward, I think. And as a result, if you look at the age profile in the Academy of Science, it's certainly old, at least on our project, on our grant. The average age is probably 60 or so. Now, at the same time, there's new money which has been injected in the university side, as I mentioned before, and universities are scrambling to compete for that money. One of the ways that they're trying to make themselves more attractive and competitive is that there's a general reorganization in the direction of the American graduate system. So they're moving towards a BA plus an MA plus a PhD system, and as one of the people at MIFI bemoaned to me, unfortunately, we've taken the worst of the American system. And MIFI, oddly enough, they did a cost-benefit analysis, and they figured that even though it's an engineering and physics institute, it would make them more attractive potential students to open up a seminary, which seems a little odd to me, but somebody's figured this out. And the fact that MIFI was, in fact, just named one of the top 3 schools in Russia after Moscow State and St. Petersburg State has now injected suddenly $3 million per year into the MIFI coffers for the next 3 years. The other thing that I'll mention is that although the private sector continues to siphon scientific talent, particularly in the direction of business, there is a growing Russian high-tech sector. So a lot of talented, especially in computer engineering. So Yandex, as far as I can tell, is in every way almost as competitive as Google. Maybe familiar with CERN, it's pretty much the biggest international particle physics lab in the world. And CERN has hired people from Yandex, not Google, to come and act as consultants to streamline information sharing among different departments. Within our group, we are subcontracting, in fact, a Russian company in St. Petersburg called Indicom, which is a small, very tight operation, and they're doing forefront stuff. They've been subcontracted by several big American firms to do technology development. So it is in fact growing. Okay, now when I let's see, I got to Moscow, I guess mid-June, and within a couple of weeks after that, there was suddenly a flurry of email among the leading foreign scientists, and I was pointed to this particular article, which basically alerted everyone to the fact that that the Academy of Science, this institution that had been established by Peter the Great back in the early 1700s, was under threat of basically being essentially taken over by the Russian government. I was totally unaware of this, but they had basically decided that they were going to move forward and attempt to reorganize under government direction, which sounds like a Detroit takeover, the Academy of Science. And in fact, this passed on July 1st, 2013. And this led to a pushback. So there was, within this group, which again, every time I think about it, it amazes me that I got invited to this select group. But within this group, there was a petition that was circulated, and there was a note that was sent to, in fact, to Putin, urging him and the government to rethink this takeover of the Academy of Science. Now, I should mention that when I asked some people, why is it that the Academy is being taken over, I think most of the people I asked answered, and their answer, they said something about the fact that, well, it's obvious, the Academy of Science has a lot of real estate in Moscow and elsewhere in the country, and that this is, of course, just a pretext. So this note was sent to the administration early July, and this is the response from Livanov, and as you can see, the law is going to be adopted in any case, and it's pointless to put up any further resistance to this. And Livanov is the director he's the Minister of Science and Education. Now personally, this largely seemed like some machinations at a very high level, maybe predictable, but it seemed like a machination at a very high level. There was a conference that was just held in Moscow. If you want, there's the link. That was attended by, I think, about 2,400 people on August 28th and 29th, and it was a conference of people of the Academy, the Russian Academy, trying to figure out how to scramble in reaction to this. Okay, and like I said, this largely seemed like an abstraction until about a week ago, when I suddenly found out that Misha had been fired from his job at iTech. And basically, if you look up the article, he was fired for the reason of creating an anti-government atmosphere within the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics. And again, the thing that's well, it just took me aback in the sense that, again, I just sort of thought about this as something that I was going on at some very high level, and I was just a spectator to. But suddenly, my counterpart on this grant was got involved. And this is there was a course, a response And that response basically mentioned Mishas' long track record. And if you're not familiar with it, some of these are among, at least in particle physics, Rubikov monopole, Kuhn. I used this textbook in graduate school. And these are among, the elite of the, at least the Russian physics community. So that's pretty much all I know right now. The implications for our grant, I'm not sure. It's hard for me to imagine that they would actually just take back the money. But I guess Friday morning I'm going to have a Skype call with Misha, and we'll figure out what's going on. So, in any case, I guess if there's one tagline from all this, it's that although obviously Russia has moved quite a ways since the times of the early 90s, nevertheless there are things that remind us, such as the entrenched bureaucracy and incidents such as this that remind us that perhaps old habits die hard. That's it. Thanks for your attention.